Texas Death Row, inside Huntsville Unit. Before dawn, when most of Texas is still asleep, a quiet ritual unfolds behind these walls. A final meal request is confirmed. Legal calls are placed. Paperwork is signed. A clock begins to matter more than ever before. Inside the Huntsville Unit, better known as the Walls, the state of Texas carries out more executions than any other state in America. And once the process begins, there is no turning back. What happens in those final hours is not chaotic. It is not loud. It is procedural, measured, controlled. But the silence is heavier than anything you can imagine. And what takes place here has shaped the national debate on capital punishment for decades. Tonight, we step inside Texas Death Row. And what we uncover is far more complex than most people realize. The Huntsville Unit opened in 1849. It is the oldest prison in Texas still in operation. For generations, it has symbolized the state's uncompromising stance on crime. But death row inmates are not housed here anymore. That surprises many people. In 1999, Texas moved its male death row population to the Polunsky Unit in Livingston, about 50 miles away. Yet executions still happen here at Huntsville. This is where the final chapter unfolds. The death chamber is located inside a small, plain brick building within the unit. No dramatic architecture. No towering Gothic halls. Just a room designed for one purpose: efficiency. But to understand what happens in that chamber, you first have to understand how someone ends up there. In Texas, capital punishment is reserved for capital murder. That includes killing a police officer, murdering a child under certain circumstances, committing murder during another felony such as robbery or kidnapping, or killing multiple people. After conviction, there is a second phase of trial, punishment. Here, jurors must answer two critical questions. First, is the defendant likely to commit future acts of violence that would constitute a continuing threat to society? Second, are there mitigating factors that warrant a sentence of life instead of death? If jurors unanimously answer that the defendant is a future danger and find no sufficient mitigating circumstances, the sentence becomes death. From that moment forward, the individual enters a legal maze that can last years, sometimes decades. Appeals, habeas petitions, federal review. But eventually, some cases run out of road. And that's when a date is set. The Polunsky Unit is where male death row inmates now live. The conditions there are stark. Every inmate is housed in single-cell confinement. 23 hours a day inside a concrete box roughly 60 square feet in size. A steel bunk bolted to the wall. A thin mattress. A stainless steel toilet and sink combination. A narrow window that barely shows the sky. No communal dining. No work assignments. No general population yard. Recreation, when granted, is alone in a small caged enclosure. It wasn't always this way. Before 1999, Texas Death Row operated differently. Inmates could interact more freely. They had limited work duties. Some even cooked meals for one another. That changed after several high-profile escape attempts and acts of violence. The state responded with permanent lockdown. Solitary confinement became standard. And the psychological toll is something rarely discussed in political debates. What does decades in isolation do to a human mind? The answer isn't simple. Some inmates withdraw entirely. Others become hyperverbal, writing letters constantly to maintain connection with the outside world. Some develop severe mental health issues. Yet the schedule never changes. Lights on. Meals passed through a slot. Count checks. Legal mail. Day after identical day. Until one morning, an officer stops at the cell and says 4 words that alter everything. You have a date. When the Texas Court of Criminal Appeals sets an execution date, the countdown begins. Typically, that date is scheduled at least 91 days in advance. That window allows final appeals, clemency petitions to the governor, and a review by the Texas Board of Pardons and Paroles. But once the calendar is marked, life on death row shifts subtly. Some inmates grow quieter. Others become more active, calling attorneys, clergy, family members. In the weeks leading up to the execution, the condemned person is transferred from Polunsky to Huntsville. They are placed in a small holding area near the execution chamber. Closer to the end. The space is clean but plain. White walls. Fluorescent lights. A metal bunk. No dramatic final walk yet. That comes later. And what happens on the final day follows a script that has been repeated hundreds of times. Texas uses lethal injection. Since 1982, when Texas became the first state to resume executions after the Supreme Court reinstated capital punishment, the method has evolved. Originally, a 3-drug protocol was used. Today, Texas uses a single drug, pentobarbital. The execution is scheduled for 6 p.m. Hours before that, the inmate can meet with spiritual advisors and family members. Texas once allowed a final meal request without spending limit, which led to national headlines when one inmate ordered an enormous feast and ate none of it. After that, the state ended the tradition of special final meals. Now, the inmate receives the standard prison dinner. There are no theatrical gestures. Just routine. But as the clock moves closer to 6, tension builds in subtle ways. Witnesses begin arriving. Executions in Texas are witnessed. Family members of the victim. Family of the condemned. Selected members of the press. Prison officials. They are escorted into separate viewing rooms divided by glass. Each room faces the execution chamber. At approximately 6 p.m., the inmate is led into the chamber and secured to the gurney with leather straps across the chest, arms, and legs. 4 lines are inserted, typically into both arms, sometimes into other accessible veins if necessary. A curtain separates the chamber from the witnesses. When everything is ready, the curtain opens. And for the first time, the condemned sees those who have come to watch. This is when the final statement is offered. Some apologize. Some proclaim innocence. Some remain silent. And then the warden gives the order. The drug is administered. Within moments, the inmate loses consciousness. Breathing slows. A physician stands by to monitor vital signs. Several minutes later, death is pronounced. The time is recorded. Paperwork is completed. Witnesses are escorted out. Outside, media representatives deliver prepared statements from both families. And the prison returns to routine. But what the public rarely sees is the internal machinery that makes this possible. Because executions in Texas are not spontaneous events. They are highly structured operations involving dozens of trained personnel. And each one carries a psychological weight of its own. Correctional officers assigned to execution detail undergo specific preparation. Participation is voluntary. Not every officer wants that responsibility. Some describe it as simply part of the job. Others quietly request reassignment afterward. The chaplain often plays a significant role, sitting near the inmate's head, offering prayers or spiritual guidance during the final moments. Medical personnel must ensure access is properly established. The warden oversees the entire process. No one rushes. Every movement is deliberate. Because mistakes are unacceptable. And Texas has faced scrutiny before. In past decades, questions have been raised about drug sourcing, dosage protocols, and potential pain during execution. Lawsuits have challenged the constitutionality of certain procedures. Yet the state has continued. More than 570 executions have been carried out in Texas since 1982, more than any other state. But numbers alone do not tell the full story. Who are the men who wait in those cells? And what crimes brought them there? The crimes that lead to death row in Texas are often brutal. Murders involving children. Killings during robberies or sexual assaults. Execution-style shootings of police officers. These cases leave permanent scars on families and communities. For many victims' families, the execution is not about revenge. It is about closure. Or at least the hope of it. But even within these cases, complexity exists. Some inmates were teenagers at the time of the crime. In 2005, the Supreme Court ruled in Roper v. Simmons that executing individuals for crimes committed under 18 is unconstitutional. Others have significant intellectual disabilities. In 2002, Atkins v. Virginia prohibited execution of intellectually disabled individuals. Each of these rulings changed who could face death in Texas. And each one forced the state to adjust its standards. Yet controversy persists. Because capital punishment is not only a legal issue. It is a moral one. And inside Huntsville, that debate feels both distant and immediate at the same time. After an execution, the Huntsville Unit does not shut down. There is no ceremony. No moment of collective pause. Inmates in other parts of the prison may be aware something has happened, but life continues. Guards resume shifts. Meals are served. Phones ring in administrative offices. But for the families involved, the moment lingers. The victim's family may feel relief. Or they may feel nothing has changed. The condemned's family begins a different kind of grieving, one often complicated by public judgment. And somewhere in Livingston, at the Polunsky Unit, men on death row process what they have just witnessed indirectly. Because when one execution happens, the others take note. They mark another date crossed off the calendar. And they wonder how much time remains on their own. What does that do to a person's sense of reality? Imagine counting years not by birthdays, but by executions. Some inmates form quiet routines to cope. Exercise in the cell. Reading. Writing legal briefs. Corresponding with pen pals. Faith becomes central for many. Others reject everything. But regardless of personal philosophy, one truth remains: the system moves forward. and the Huntsville Unit stands ready for the next scheduled date. The final walk from holding cell to execution chamber is only a short distance. No dramatic hallway. No long procession. Just a few measured steps. But in those seconds, everything that led to this point converges. Years of appeals. Public protests. Court rulings. Victim impact statements. All reduced to the sound of boots against concrete. The door opens. The chamber waits. And history adds another name to a long list. Yet even now, questions remain. Does the death penalty deter crime? Is it applied fairly across race and socioeconomic lines? Are wrongful convictions possible? Texas has exonerated several individuals from death row over the decades due to DNA evidence or prosecutorial misconduct. Each exoneration fuels debate. Each execution reinforces division. Inside Huntsville, those larger arguments fade into procedure. The staff follow protocol. The system functions as designed. But outside these walls, the conversation never truly ends. Because the existence of a death chamber forces society to confront its own boundaries. What is justice? What is mercy? And who decides when one outweighs the other? As long as the Huntsville Unit remains operational, those questions will linger in the Texas air, quiet, persistent, unresolved. And the next execution date is always already on the calendar. Long before an execution date is set, death row is already a world apart. At the Polunsky Unit, time doesn't pass in months or seasons. It passes in routines. Around 3 a.m., lights flicker on for count. Officers walk tier to tier, stopping at each solid steel door, confirming presence. Every inmate must show movement, an arm, a leg, proof of life. The ritual is repeated multiple times a day. Nothing is left to assumption. Breakfast trays slide through narrow slots. Oatmeal, powdered eggs, milk, sometimes fruit. Meals are eaten alone, often on the edge of a bunk that is bolted permanently to concrete. There are no job assignments here. No kitchen duty. No laundry detail. No license plates being stamped, as happens in other Texas prisons. Death row inmates in Texas do not work. They wait. And in that waiting, hierarchies quietly form. Not gang hierarchies in the traditional sense, though gang affiliation exists, but hierarchies of influence. Some inmates are known jailhouse lawyers, deeply familiar with appellate law. Others are religious mentors, guiding cell-to-cell conversations shouted through doors. A few become writers, building relationships with people outside who send books and letters. Communication is improvised. Voices carry down the tier through vents and cracks. Messages are passed by yelling at just the right angle. Sometimes coded tapping becomes a language of its own. But isolation shapes everything. Unlike general population prisons in Texas, where violence can erupt in shared spaces, death row violence is rare. There are no shared day rooms. No open dormitories. Every man is alone. Yet tension never disappears. Because everyone knows that at some point, an officer may stop and deliver the date. And once that happens, life accelerates. For many men on Texas death row, legal work becomes survival. Appeals are layered and complex. Direct appeal. State habeas corpus petition. Federal habeas corpus petition. Requests for evidentiary hearings. Motions for DNA testing. Petitions for clemency. Years are consumed by paperwork. Some inmates develop a deep understanding of procedural law. They memorize deadlines. Study Supreme Court rulings. Debate precedents through steel doors with neighboring inmates. It is not unusual for a man on death row to know more about his case than anyone else alive. And yet, the statistics are sobering. The majority of death sentences in Texas are ultimately upheld. Still, hope survives in narrow spaces. DNA evidence has overturned convictions before. Witness recantations have surfaced decades later. Prosecutorial misconduct has been exposed in post-conviction review. Every new exoneration sends a ripple through Polunsky. If it happened for him, could it happen for me? That question sustains some. For others, faith replaces legal optimism. Chaplains visit regularly. Christian, Muslim, Jewish, and other spiritual leaders are permitted access. Religious texts become anchors in cells stripped of nearly everything else. Some inmates convert while on death row. Others deepen beliefs they carried long before arrest. When execution dates approach, spirituality intensifies. Confessions are made. Forgiveness is sought. But forgiveness is not guaranteed. And reconciliation, when it happens at all, is often partial. The legal machinery that leads to execution is precise. In Texas, the Court of Criminal Appeals is the highest criminal court in the state. It alone has the authority to set execution dates. When all appeals have been exhausted, prosecutors request a date. Judges review the procedural record. If no legal barriers remain, the date is signed. From that moment, a clock begins. The condemned is notified formally. Attorneys scramble for last-minute filings. Clemency applications are prepared and submitted to the Texas Board of Pardons and Paroles. This board reviews petitions and makes recommendations to the governor. In Texas, the governor cannot grant clemency independently without the board's recommendation. Clemency is rare. Very rare. But it has happened. And that slim possibility keeps phones ringing in law offices across the country during the final week before an execution. Because sometimes, what happens in the final 72 hours changes everything. Stay with that thought. We'll come back to it. When execution week arrives, the inmate is transferred from Polunsky to Huntsville. The trip is quiet. Heavily secured. Unannounced to the public. The Huntsville Unit has a designated holding area near the execution chamber. It is here the condemned will spend his final days. Security tightens. Observation increases. The inmate is monitored continuously. Some sleep. Some do not. Visits are scheduled. Attorneys arrive. Spiritual advisors sit across metal tables. Family members pass through security checkpoints, knowing this is likely the last time they will see their loved one alive. Conversations in these rooms are private but heavy. Regret may surface. Anger may surface. Or silence. There is no single emotional pattern. But there is always the ticking of time. Texas once allowed physical contact in these final visits under limited circumstances. Policies have shifted over time, influenced by security concerns and litigation. In recent years, debates have arisen about whether spiritual advisors may physically touch the inmate during execution itself. Court battles have reached the Supreme Court over religious access in the chamber. Even at the edge of death, legal disputes continue. Because in America, even the final act of punishment exists within constitutional boundaries. Or at least, it attempts to. But what is rarely discussed is the internal emotional rhythm of the final 24 hours. How does a person prepare for a scheduled death? Some write final letters. Some record last words in advance for family. Some request specific scriptures. Others withdraw completely. And outside, reporters gather. Victims' families prepare statements. Advocacy groups hold vigils. The atmosphere around Huntsville grows charged, though nothing visible has changed inside. And then the final day arrives. The final meal policy in Texas is deliberately unremarkable now. No lavish requests. No personalized menus. The condemned receives the same meal served to the rest of the unit. This policy shift followed a widely publicized case in which a large meal was requested but never eaten. Public backlash prompted the state to eliminate special requests. Now, the symbolism is gone. The system prefers uniformity. After dinner, visitation concludes. Phones may ring with final legal updates. Sometimes, last-minute appeals are filed even hours before the scheduled time. Federal courts may issue temporary stays. Or they may deny them. Those final hours are unpredictable. But once all courts decline intervention, the sequence moves forward without hesitation. And this is where Huntsville becomes the focal point. Shortly before 6 p.m., the condemned is escorted from the holding cell to the chamber. The walk is brief. Officers position him onto the gurney. Straps are secured. And 4 team inserts lines, typically 1 in each arm. Backup lines are prepared in case of complications. Witnesses are seated behind glass. The curtain opens. The warden asks if there are any final words. In Texas, final statements are public record. Some inmates express remorse and apologize directly to victims' families. Others maintain innocence until the last breath. Some speak for several minutes. Others say nothing at all. After the statement, the order is given. The pentobarbital is administered in a lethal dose. Consciousness fades. Breathing slows. A physician confirms the absence of cardiac activity. The time is noted. And with that, another execution is complete. But what happens next, inside the minds of those involved, is rarely documented. Officers do not publicly discuss their emotions. The culture within corrections emphasizes professionalism and composure. Yet carrying out executions can leave psychological residue. Some officers describe compartmentalization, viewing the process strictly as a legal duty. Others struggle privately. Chaplains often serve not only inmates, but staff. Because the ritual affects everyone in the room. And then there are the families. Victims' relatives sometimes express relief, believing justice has been served. Others find the execution does not erase pain. For the family of the condemned, grief unfolds under scrutiny. Public perception can be harsh. Their mourning complicated. Meanwhile, at Polunsky, word spreads quickly. An execution has occurred. Another name removed. Another empty cell. The silence on the tier deepens for a while afterward. Because each man understands that the machinery that moved today will move again. Perhaps for him. perhaps sooner than expected. Texas continues to lead the nation in executions. Supporters argue it delivers justice for the most heinous crimes. Opponents argue it risks irreversible error. Statistics fluctuate year to year, influenced by court rulings and prosecutorial decisions. But the Huntsville Unit remains prepared. The chamber is maintained. Protocols are reviewed. Because as long as capital punishment exists in Texas law, the process will continue. And somewhere inside a 60-square-foot cell in Livingston, a man lies awake, calculating time. Not in hours. Not in days. But in the space between execution dates. What happens when hope and inevitability exist in the same room? What does prolonged anticipation do to the human spirit? And when history looks back on this era of capital punishment, how will it judge the choices made behind those red brick walls? The Huntsville Unit does not answer those questions. It simply carries out its function. Quietly. Deliberately. Again and again. And the next date is already set. There is something else that defines Texas death row: time distortion. Men arrive here often in their 20s or 30s. Years pass. Appeals stretch on. Governors change. Wardens retire. Supreme Court precedents shift. Yet the cell remains the same. For some, 2 decades pass between sentencing and execution. That length of time creates a strange dual reality. On one hand, the state insists the punishment is decisive. On the other, the condemned may spend half a lifetime waiting for it. Psychologists have debated what this prolonged anticipation does to the mind. Some refer to it as death row phenomenon, a term describing the mental strain caused by extended isolation combined with uncertainty. Texas does not formally recognize the phrase. But the conditions are undeniable. Solitary confinement. Limited physical contact. Constant surveillance. Repeated awareness of scheduled executions happening down the line. And every time a stay is granted at the last minute, hope spikes across the tier. Only to settle again. Sometimes lower than before. Texas' modern execution era began in 1982, when it carried out the first lethal injection in the United States after capital punishment was reinstated nationwide in 1976. The state quickly became the epicenter of executions in America. During the late 1990s and early 2000s, executions occurred with striking frequency, sometimes multiple in a single month. The national spotlight intensified. Supporters cited falling crime rates and argued that firm sentencing deterred violent offenders. Critics pointed to racial disparities in sentencing, the quality of defense representation in capital trials, and the risk of executing the innocent. The debate grew louder after several exonerations. Men once scheduled for execution walked free after DNA evidence contradicted eyewitness testimony or exposed flawed forensic science. Each exoneration shook public confidence. But each execution reinforced the system's resolve. Texas did not pause. It recalibrated. Drug protocols were modified when pharmaceutical companies restricted access to certain chemicals. Legal procedures were refined in response to court rulings. Execution schedules slowed compared to their peak years, but they never stopped. And Huntsville remained central. Because regardless of where the inmate is housed, the final act always returns to that chamber. Huntsville itself is often called Prison City, USA. Multiple state prison facilities operate in and around the town. The Texas Department of Criminal Justice has long been a major employer here. For many residents, the prison is not a symbol of controversy. It is part of daily life. Some families have worked in corrections for generations. Children grow up understanding that executions occur a few blocks from their schools and churches. Yet even in Huntsville, execution nights carry a different atmosphere. Roads near the unit are monitored. Media presence increases. Advocacy groups gather outside the walls holding signs, some in support of the sentence, others in opposition. Candles flicker in the dark. Prayers are spoken on sidewalks. Inside, the procedure unfolds in silence. 2 worlds existing only yards apart. One chanting. One methodical. Neither fully touching the other. Clemency in Texas is one of the final safeguards. The Texas Board of Pardons and Paroles reviews applications and votes on whether to recommend commutation to life imprisonment or grant a reprieve. The board's deliberations are confidential. Votes are often brief. The governor cannot act alone without their recommendation. Historically, clemency is rarely granted. But on the rare occasion it is, the announcement spreads through Polunsky like electricity. An execution halted. A life extended. For those still waiting, it reopens a door that had nearly closed. But for most, the final days proceed uninterrupted. And sometimes, what happens in the final hour becomes the most controversial part of all. Over the years, lethal injection has faced legal challenges across the country. Questions about drug sourcing intensified when pharmaceutical companies refused to allow their medications to be used in executions. Texas turned to compounding pharmacies. Lawsuits followed, arguing about transparency and potential suffering. The state defended its methods, asserting the protocol met constitutional standards against cruel and unusual punishment. In several cases nationwide, not only in Texas, executions drew scrutiny when inmates appeared to struggle or gasp after injection. Medical experts debated what those signs meant. Supporters insisted the drug rendered inmates unconscious rapidly. Opponents questioned whether monitoring was sufficient. Courts examined evidence. Protocols were reviewed. But executions resumed. Because for Texas, the method may evolve, but the outcome remains the same. Finality. Lost in legal arguments and procedural detail are the original crimes. Behind every capital case is a victim. A child whose life ended abruptly. A police officer killed in the line of duty. A family shattered by violence. For many victims' relatives, the execution date is a milestone they never wanted but cannot avoid. Some attend the execution in person. Others refuse, choosing not to witness another death. Some speak to the media afterward. Others retreat into privacy. Closure is not uniform. And neither is grief. At the same time, families of the condemned navigate a parallel pain. Parents who raised a son now labeled irredeemable. Children who grew up visiting their father through thick glass. Siblings who carry a last name tied forever to a headline. Capital punishment does not isolate suffering to one side. It expands it. That reality complicates the narrative more than statistics ever could. Lost in legal arguments and procedural detail are the original crimes. Behind every capital case is a victim. A child whose life ended abruptly. A police officer killed in the line of duty. A family shattered by violence. For many victims' relatives, the execution date is a milestone they never wanted but cannot avoid. Some attend the execution in person. Others refuse, choosing not to witness another death. Some speak to the media afterward. Others retreat into privacy. Closure is not uniform. And neither is grief. At the same time, families of the condemned navigate a parallel pain. Parents who raised a son now labeled irredeemable. Children who grew up visiting their father through thick glass. Siblings who carry a last name tied forever to a headline. Capital punishment does not isolate suffering to one side. It expands it. That reality complicates the narrative more than statistics ever could. There is a paradox at the heart of Texas death row. The system is designed to be unemotional, structured, precise. But it operates on matters of life and death, the most emotional territory imaginable. Inside Polunsky, men wake each morning unsure if their appeals will succeed. Inside Huntsville, staff prepare for tasks they hope to carry out flawlessly, yet infrequently. Outside, communities debate morality, justice, fairness. No single narrative captures it fully. Is it justice served? Is it punishment carried too far? Is it a necessary deterrent? Or an irreversible mistake waiting to happen? The answers depend on who is speaking. But the machinery does not depend on opinion. It depends on law. And when the law authorizes an execution date, the sequence begins again. From above, the Huntsville Unit looks almost small against the Texas horizon. Red brick walls. Guard towers. A few contained acres in a state that stretches endlessly. Yet within those walls, decisions carry permanent weight. Lives end here by deliberate design. And each execution leaves behind questions that echo far beyond the chamber. Questions about accountability. About redemption. About certainty. Because the death penalty is unlike any other punishment. It does not allow correction after the fact. It does not permit reconsideration once carried out. It closes the file completely. Inside Texas death row, that finality is understood by everyone involved. The inmate strapped to the gurney. The officer securing the restraints. The family watching through glass. The town that grows quiet for an evening. And somewhere in Livingston, another man listening to the distant silence after a name is removed from the roster. He lies back on his bunk. Stares at the ceiling. And wonders how many more sunsets remain. The Huntsville Unit does not answer him. It simply waits. Because in Texas, as long as the law permits it, the chamber will open again. And the clock will start over. If there's one thing the Huntsville Unit teaches us, it's this: justice is never simple. Behind every execution date is a crime that shattered lives, a legal process that stretched for years, and a system that believes it is carrying out the law with precision. But precision does not erase complexity. And finality does not silence doubt. Texas death row continues to operate quietly, methodically, out of public view. Yet the questions it raises remain loud, about accountability, fairness, redemption, and the irreversible power of the state. The chamber in Huntsville will open again. Another date will be set. another name will be read. And the debate will continue. Because when punishment becomes permanent, the conversation can never truly end.